It was a warm, sunlit afternoon in a small suburban town, where the streets were lined with towering oak trees and neat houses with white picket fences. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Birds chirped merrily as the sound of a lawnmower hummed in the distance. The world outside was peaceful, but in the heart of the neighborhood, things were about to take a turn. Susan, a middle-aged woman with sharp, calculating eyes and meticulously done hair, sat on her front porch, sipping iced tea from a glass pitcher. She was dressed in a floral sundress, her legs crossed elegantly, and her posture perfect as always. Her house, with its perfectly manicured lawn, reflected the calm order she liked to keep in her life. She had lived in this neighborhood for years, and her home was her sanctuary. It was quiet here, safe. She liked it that way. Susan's eyes wandered down the street, scanning the scene. Everything seemed to be in place. The kids riding bikes on the sidewalks, the elderly couple walking their dog, the occasional car passing by. But then, she spotted something that made her pause. Isaiah, a black boy of about 16, walked slowly down the sidewalk, his hands shoved in the pockets of his hoodie. His backpack hung loosely over his shoulder. He wasn't doing anything that screamed dangerous, but something about the way he moved, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, his pace slow but deliberate, made Susan's stomach tighten. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not on this street. Not today. Susan's gaze lingered on him as he passed her house. There was something in his demeanor that didn't sit right with her, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. He's just lingering, Susan muttered to herself. Maybe, just making sure no one's watching. She set her glass of iced tea down on the porch table and stood up, her eyes still locked on Isaiah. She took a step forward, gripping the railing, trying to convince herself that she was overreacting. But a little voice in the back of her mind kept whispering, "Something's not right." The street was quiet, too quiet. Was he looking for something? Or someone? Maybe it was just a hunch. She had been raised to be cautious of unfamiliar faces, especially when they made her uncomfortable. Inside Susan's home, the atmosphere was tense, as if something was waiting to happen. Susan's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone on the kitchen counter. She dialed 911, her thumb pressing the digits a little too quickly, too forcefully. The phone rang once, then twice. 911 operator. 911. What is your emergency? Susan's breath caught in her throat. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it shook ever so slightly. Susan, yes, I need to report something. There's a young boy, a black boy, walking down my street. He's acting suspicious, like he's watching the houses. I'm just, I'm not sure if I feel safe. Her voice wavered with uncertainty, as though she herself was questioning whether or not she was being unreasonable. But there was an unease growing in her chest that she couldn't ignore. 911 operator, can you describe him? What is he wearing? Susan, he's got on a hoodie and a backpack. He's young, maybe around 16 or 17. I don't know, but he's just standing there, pacing. It doesn't seem right. The operator's voice was calm and professional. 911 operator, ma'am, I understand. We'll send an officer to check on him. Please stay inside and do not approach him. Susan, I will. I'll stay inside. She hung up the phone and looked out the window again, still watching Isaiah as he walked down the street, seemingly oblivious to her growing concern. Her stomach churned with a mix of fear and guilt. She wasn't sure why she felt this way, but she was certain something needed to be done. A few miles away, at the local police station, the afternoon shift was just starting to wind down. Officer Walker, a seasoned officer with graying hair and a broad, solid build, sat behind the dispatch desk, sipping his coffee. His uniform was slightly disheveled, his tie loose, and he looked more tired than usual. The radio crackled, piercing the quiet. A dispatch message. Dispatch, Unit 14, we have a call about a suspicious person on Maple Street. A young black male, wearing a hoodie and carrying a backpack. Caller reports unusual behavior. Please respond. Officer Walker glanced at the clock on the wall, then sighed. Another call. Another suspicious person report. The life of a police officer in a quiet suburb could sometimes feel repetitive. He stood up and grabbed his keys from the hook by the door. Officer Walker, muttering to himself, another one of these. He wasn't expecting much, probably just another misunderstanding, another innocent teen on his way home from school. But it was his job to check it out, and that was exactly what he intended to do. Back on the quiet street, Isaiah walked alone, oblivious to the eyes following his every move. The hum of his sneakers on the pavement was the only sound that filled the silence. He glanced up at the houses he passed, but they seemed to be just as ordinary as they always were. He kept his head down, his mind preoccupied with the usual thoughts: homework, friends, and what his mom had planned for dinner. But then, out of nowhere, he heard the sound of a car slowing down behind him. The tires made a soft screech against the pavement, and he instinctively looked over his shoulder. The police car was pulling up beside him. Isaiah froze. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Why was the officer stopping him? Isaiah, quietly, can I help you, officer? The police car came to a full stop. The officer, Walker, stepped out of the car slowly, his boots tapping on the asphalt. He wore a serious look on his face, scanning Isaiah with a glance that made the young boy feel instantly small. Officer Walker, hey son, you mind if I ask what you're doing out here? Isaiah looked up at the officer, his nervousness mounting. He didn't know what was going on, but the officer's authoritative tone made him uneasy. Was this really happening? As Officer Walker walked up to Isaiah, the boy's heart raced. His mind scrambled for a way to explain himself, but nothing made sense. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't breaking any rules. Isaiah, I'm just walking home from school, officer. I don't mean any harm. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his nerves. Officer Walker, I see. Just walking home. Huh? I've got a report here that says you're acting suspicious. Are you sure there's nothing you're hiding? Isaiah took a deep breath. He knew it wasn't going to help to argue. Isaiah, I'm not hiding anything. I live just down the street, officer. I'm just heading home. It's really nothing. The officer gave him a long, hard look, clearly skeptical. He asked Isaiah to empty his pockets, to show him what was in his backpack. Isaiah hesitated for a moment, but then complied. He opened his bag, revealing textbooks, a notebook, and a few pens. Nothing to hide. Nothing unusual. Isaiah, see? Just books and stuff. But Officer Walker was still scanning Isaiah's face, trying to read his expression, searching for a hint of something more. Inside the police car, Officer Walker was still processing the situation. He radioed dispatch, his voice calm but cautious. Officer Walker, dispatch. This is Unit 14. I'm on Maple. The kid's got nothing on him, just books in his bag. Looks like he's just on his way home from school. The radio crackled back to life. Dispatch, Unit 14. We have confirmation. The boy may be the son of the police captain. His name is Isaiah Walker. Please confirm. Officer Walker paused. The name rang a bell. Isaiah Walker? His heart skipped a beat as he realized something. The boy he was talking to wasn't just any random teenager. This was the son of the police captain. A heavy silence filled the air between them as Officer Walker processed the truth. The situation was not what he thought it was. The pieces were starting to fall into place. The sun hung low in the sky as Officer Walker remained in his patrol car, the sound of the radio crackling softly beside him. His thoughts were still tangled around the discovery he'd just made. Isaiah Walker. The boy he was questioning was the police captain's son. Before he could process much more, a second police car pulled up behind him, the sirens wailing for a split second before they stopped. The officer who stepped out was Officer Davis, a young, ambitious officer with a sharp look in his eyes. He glanced briefly at Officer Walker, who was still sitting behind the wheel of his car, lost in thought. Officer Davis, nodding, what's the situation? Officer Walker, sighing deeply, just got a call about a suspicious kid. Nothing to it. But turns out he's the captain's son. Officer Davis raised an eyebrow. The situation had just shifted dramatically. Officer Davis, captain's kid? That's a bit of a twist. What's he doing out here? Officer Walker, looking out the window, hesitating. I don't know. He says he's just walking home from school. But that's not really the point, is it? We need to be careful. Back at the house on Maple Street, Susan stood by her window, watching the scene unfold in front of her. She had hoped that when the police arrived, they would take care of whatever trouble was brewing. But now, as she saw two officers talking to the boy, and what seemed like even more officers arriving, she couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of unease. She fidgeted nervously with the hem of her cardigan. The moment had escalated quickly, and Susan could no longer tell if she had made the right decision. The street was still, eerily quiet, but she could see the officers talking to Isaiah. Their body language had changed, more relaxed than before. Susan, to herself, shaking her head. Why are they letting him go so easily? He's up to something, I'm sure of it. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, as though warding off the creeping sense of guilt. Had she been wrong to call? She wondered if the officers would be lenient just because of who the boy's father was. From her porch, she could hear snippets of conversation. The officers were now speaking more quietly, their tone softer. She could see Isaiah standing tall, his expression a little more confident now, though still cautious. With the arrival of Officer Davis, the situation began to shift. The tension that had filled the air earlier now seemed to evaporate, replaced by a new kind of awareness. Isaiah stood a little straighter, his body language no longer that of a frightened teenager, but someone who had just realized that things weren't as they seemed. Officer Walker walked up to Isaiah again, taking a moment to study him. Isaiah noticed the change in the officer's demeanor. It was as if the weight of the conversation had lifted. Officer Walker, softening his tone, Isaiah, right? Isaiah nodded, his shoulders stiffening at the sound of his name. Isaiah, yes, sir. That's my name. Officer Walker, nodding, I've got to call in to verify something. You're the police captain's son, right? Isaiah's eyes widened slightly, and he could see the moment of realization wash over the officer's face. Isaiah, nervously, yes, I am. The officers exchanged looks, and there was a brief moment of silence. Officer Walker, sighing, we didn't know it was you. We got a report about someone acting suspicious, but there's no harm done. I'll need to make a call to confirm everything, but it seems like you're just out for a walk. Nothing to worry about. Isaiah wasn't sure how to react. He had never been in a situation like this before, where something as simple as walking home had turned into a police encounter. And now, the officers seemed more relaxed, more understanding. But there was something about the whole situation that made Isaiah feel uneasy. Did they think less of him now that they knew who he was? Isaiah, quietly, I wasn't doing anything wrong. Just walking home. Officer Walker gave him a small nod, though his eyes still held a quiet scrutiny. As Officer Walker walked back to his patrol car to confirm Isaiah's identity, Officer Davis stayed behind with Isaiah. The two of them stood in silence for a few moments, the air still thick with uncertainty. Isaiah, for the first time, relaxed slightly. He had always been cautious around police officers. His father's job as captain of the police department meant that Isaiah was always aware of the weight of his family's name. But today, things felt different. The way the officers were reacting to him was something he had never expected. Officer Davis, breaking the silence, it's tough, huh? Being the captain's kid, I mean. Isaiah looked up at him, startled by the question. Isaiah, I don't know. It's just, I didn't expect to be treated like this just for walking home. Officer Davis looked at him sympathetically. Officer Davis, yeah, well, people always see something else. A little suspicion, a little fear. I'm sure it wasn't easy, huh? But this is our job. We have to look out for things that don't seem right, even when they're not. Isaiah nodded, his thoughts drifting back to the call Susan had made earlier. The idea that a simple act of walking down his own street could be perceived as something suspicious hurt. He didn't want to be seen through the lens of his skin color or his father's badge. Inside her house, Susan felt the weight of the minutes stretch on endlessly. She had been watching for what felt like hours, but the officers were still talking to Isaiah. She could see the tension, the uncertainty, even if she couldn't hear the words. Susan, muttering to herself, what if I made a mistake? What if I've caused this kid more trouble than I meant to? She was no longer sure of herself. Her initial gut reaction had been to protect her neighborhood, but now she was questioning whether her own fears had clouded her judgment. Could she have overreacted? Had she misunderstood the situation? Susan, shaking her head, no, no, I did the right thing. He was acting suspicious, and I had to call. I had to. She leaned back against the window, still watching the officers as they spoke in hushed tones, occasionally glancing at Isaiah. Everything inside her screamed that she had done what was necessary. But now, she wasn't sure if the outcome would prove her right. Would she ever get the answers she needed? Inside the patrol car, Officer Walker's fingers brushed the radio once more. The quiet crackling of the airwaves filled the air, and then the voice of the dispatcher echoed through the car. Dispatch, Unit 14, please confirm the identity of the subject. Isaiah Walker, son of Captain Walker. The boy is well known in our system. Proceed accordingly. Officer Walker's eyes widened slightly, and he glanced toward Isaiah, who was still standing in front of him. A part of him had known something was off, but now the truth was undeniable. He gave a small nod to himself, trying to process the significance of the moment. The boy standing in front of him wasn't just another teenager. He was the son of the person in charge of all law enforcement in the town. The dynamics were shifting, and Officer Walker knew that this wasn't just about a suspicious kid on a quiet street. It was something more. With a deep breath, he keyed the mic on his radio. Officer Walker, dispatch, Unit 14. The subject is confirmed. Proceeding with caution. And just like that, the situation began to evolve. There was more at play here than anyone could have expected. Inside the police station, news of the situation had already spread. Captain Walker, Isaiah's father, was sitting at his desk, scanning a report when his phone rang. It was the station's dispatcher, voice serious. Dispatcher, Captain, we've got a situation on Maple Street. Your son was stopped by Officer Walker. There's been some confusion, but everything's under control. Just wanted to keep you in the loop. Captain Walker leaned back in his chair, a frown creasing his brow. His mind raced. Isaiah? On Maple Street? At a time like this? Captain Walker, with a sigh, I'll be there in 5. As Officer Walker stood talking with Isaiah, he felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had already radioed in the confirmation. Isaiah was indeed the captain's son, and yet the interaction between the two officers had shifted, become more complicated than it had been a few minutes earlier. Isaiah shifted nervously under their gaze. The words suspicious and questioned still floated heavily in the air. Isaiah didn't know what to feel. His nerves had been frayed since the police car first rolled up behind him, but now it was even worse. Before the awkward silence could stretch on any longer, the sound of a car engine revving up and approaching caught their attention. Captain Walker's black SUV came to a sudden stop in front of the scene, the tires skidding slightly against the pavement. Captain Walker stepped out, his uniform sharp, his presence commanding. His eyes scanned the situation and locked onto Isaiah instantly. Captain Walker, calm but stern. Isaiah, what's going on here? Isaiah's stomach dropped. His father's tone was firm, but not angry. He could sense the undercurrent of disappointment, the kind of look a father gave his son when he knew something had gone wrong, even if the son didn't fully understand it himself. Isaiah, hesitantly, I was just walking home, Dad. I don't know what happened. They stopped me, and now they're asking me questions like I did something wrong. Captain Walker looked at Officer Walker, whose expression softened when their eyes met. He could tell that this wasn't an easy situation for anyone involved. Captain Walker, to Officer Walker, what happened? Officer Walker, with a sigh, Ma'am, we got a report from a caller about suspicious behavior. He was walking on Maple, looking around, maybe a little too casually. The report said he was acting suspicious. I stopped him, but he didn't have anything on him. It all seemed harmless, just routine. Captain Walker's gaze softened as he turned back to Isaiah. There was a moment of quiet tension hanging in the air. Captain Walker, addressing Isaiah. I'm not angry with you, son, but I need to know what you were doing. Why were you out here? Isaiah looked down, his thoughts racing. Was this his fault? Had he done something to provoke the suspicion of a neighbor? Isaiah, quietly, I was just walking, Dad. Just walking home from school. I didn't even know anyone was watching me. I didn't do anything. Captain Walker placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it lightly, a sign of reassurance. Captain Walker, it's all right. We'll talk about this later. You're okay. But as Captain Walker's eyes turned to Officer Walker, his face hardened slightly. The situation wasn't as simple as he wanted it to be. Isaiah stood silently beside his father, feeling the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. His father's authority had always been a constant presence in their home, but today, in front of the officers, Isaiah could feel the weight of it even more. Captain Walker turned to Officer Walker and then to Officer Davis, who had remained silent, standing off to the side. Captain Walker, to the officers, we both know what's happening here, don't we? It's the look, the assumptions people make when they see my son out in public. You might not have meant it this way, but we both know how these situations play out. We can't pretend it's just about a routine check. There was an uncomfortable silence. Officer Walker's face tightened. He wasn't used to this kind of conversation, especially not with the captain. Officer Walker, I didn't mean to cause trouble, sir. I thought it was just a precaution. Captain Walker, his voice low, I understand, but precautions are dangerous when they're based on fear and assumptions. And in this case, I think we're all learning that lesson today. Isaiah looked down at his shoes, avoiding his father's gaze. His chest felt heavy, like a weight he couldn't shake. Inside her home, Susan paced back and forth. The tension of the past few hours had worn her thin. She had watched the exchange between Isaiah and the officers, and now, she wasn't sure what to make of it. The officers seemed more relaxed now, less urgent in their questioning, almost like they were treating the situation with more respect than before. Susan hesitated before picking up the phone again. She felt the need to know what had happened. Had the officers found something that explained their initial suspicion? Susan, on the phone to a friend, I don't know what to think anymore. I saw them talking to him. They stopped him, and now they're just letting him go. I don't understand. He was suspicious. Why are they just letting him go? Her friend's voice came back, calm and understanding. Friend, maybe it was a misunderstanding. You said he was walking slowly, right? Maybe they were just doing their job. Susan, but why not check him properly? I don't know. There's something about that boy. Something I can't shake. As she hung up the phone, a sense of unease settled deeper into her stomach. Something wasn't right, but the more she thought about it, the more she wasn't sure whether her discomfort had anything to do with Isaiah or something else entirely. After his father's words, Isaiah stood in the yard, alone. The officers had left, and it was just him and his father now, the quiet evenings stretching before them. Isaiah's thoughts churned. This wasn't just a random encounter. It wasn't just about him walking down the street. It was about a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. Who was he in the eyes of the world? He was the son of the police captain, yes, but was that all people saw when they looked at him? The color of his skin? The badge his father wore? Isaiah was tired. Tired of being seen through the lens of assumptions. Tired of having his every move watched. And even more, he was tired of feeling that something as simple as walking down the street could turn into something far more complicated. He looked over at his father, who was talking to another officer in the distance, his tone steady but weary. Isaiah, to himself, quietly, is this who I'm always going to be? The kid everyone's watching, even when I do nothing wrong? As the evening began to darken, Captain Walker approached Isaiah, his footsteps heavy on the sidewalk. He stopped in front of his son, looking down at him with a mixture of concern and love. Captain Walker, I know it's not easy, son. You're growing up in a world where some people see things differently. But that doesn't mean you have to carry it all alone. You don't have to change who you are. Isaiah didn't say anything for a moment. He simply looked at his father, unsure of how to respond. Captain Walker, we'll figure this out together. But remember, You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Just be yourself. That's all anyone can ask of you. Isaiah nodded slowly, the weight of his father's words settling over him. He wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, he realized something important. He wasn't alone. The next morning, Isaiah sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. His father, Captain Walker, was sitting across from him, silently sipping his own drink. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. The events of the previous day were still fresh in both their minds. Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the world was looking at him through a different lens. His father, however, seemed calm and distant, as though processing a new layer of responsibility. Captain Walker, finally breaking the silence. How are you feeling about yesterday? Isaiah didn't look up, his gaze focused on the empty space in front of him. He was still trying to make sense of everything. The call, the officer's treatment of him, his father's position. Isaiah, quietly, I don't know. It felt like they were treating me differently. Like I wasn't just a kid walking home. I don't know if it was because of who I am, or just because of what they think I could be. Captain Walker set his cup down and leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but warm. Captain Walker, I know it's tough, son, but we can't always control how people see us. What we can control is how we react, what we stand for. Isaiah looked up at him, meeting his father's eyes for the first time that morning. There was a weight to his words that Isaiah hadn't fully understood until now. His father wasn't just talking about yesterday. He was talking about a lifetime of these kinds of encounters, moments where the world would try to define him by its own terms. Isaiah, nodding slowly, it's just hard, you know? I don't want to be that kid. The one who's always looked at like he's trouble. Like I'm guilty before I even say anything. Captain Walker's expression softened, his voice almost a whisper. Captain Walker, I know it's hard, but you don't have to be who they say you are. You've got your own story to write. Isaiah felt a flicker of something in his chest. It was the faintest spark of hope. Hope that he could break free from the narrative others wanted to impose on him. But that hope was fragile. He wasn't sure he could believe it just yet. Across town, Susan sat in her living room, her phone in her hands, her mind far from the present. She had been replaying the events of the previous day over and over, the police encounter with Isaiah a constant, nagging presence in her thoughts. She had intended to call for help when she saw something suspicious, to protect her neighborhood, her family. But now, after hearing about Isaiah's identity, she was filled with uncertainty. She hadn't expected things to escalate the way they had. Susan, to herself, quietly, did I do the right thing? Did I make things worse? Her mind kept returning to Isaiah's face when the officers let him go. He hadn't seemed like a criminal, just a teenager caught in a situation beyond his control. And now, Susan wondered if she had just added another layer of fear and suspicion to a world that already saw him differently because of the color of his skin. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the numbers she had written down. It was Captain Walker's number, the one she had gotten through a mutual acquaintance in the neighborhood. Susan, muttering, I should call him. I should apologize. But what could she say? How could she explain the feeling of unease that had led her to make that call? Could she take back what she had done? Or would it make things worse? The phone vibrated in her hand, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a text from a friend, asking if she was okay after the events of yesterday. Susan stared at the screen, a sense of dread creeping over her. At the police station, Officer Davis sat at his desk, staring at the folder in front of him. He had spent hours thinking about yesterday's encounter. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had known Isaiah was the captain's son, but the way the situation unfolded had left him with more questions than answers. Officer Davis, muttering under his breath, it wasn't supposed to be like that. Not with him. His partner, Officer Turner, a more seasoned officer with a reputation for always following protocol, looked over at him, sensing his unease. Officer Turner, you've been quiet since yesterday. Something on your mind, Davis? Officer Davis, pausing, I don't know. There was something off about the way we treated him. I know it's protocol to question someone acting suspicious, but he wasn't acting suspicious. He was just a kid walking home. What if we made a mistake? What if this happens again? Officer Turner, leaning back in his chair, you're overthinking it. We did what we had to do. It's our job to respond to calls. You did your job, and so did I. But Davis wasn't convinced. The look in Isaiah's eyes, the confusion, the fear, had stayed with him. He had grown up in a neighborhood much like Isaiah's, and while he didn't share the same struggles, he couldn't ignore the feeling that they might have treated Isaiah unfairly. Officer Davis, I don't know, Turner. It just didn't feel right. We need to be better. I need to be better. Later that day, Isaiah decided to take a walk through his neighborhood. He hadn't been outside much since the incident, and something in him urged him to step out and clear his head. The streets were quiet, the houses on Maple Street looking almost too perfect in the late afternoon light. As he walked, he passed by the homes of his friends, people he had known since childhood. But today, it felt different. The world felt distant, like he was viewing it through a glass pane. Everything felt normal on the surface, but Isaiah knew that things had changed for him, at least in the eyes of some of the people around him. As he rounded the corner, he saw Susan standing on her porch, looking at him with a mixture of guilt and hesitation. When their eyes met, Susan seemed to freeze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Isaiah took a deep breath, his body tensing slightly. He had a million things to say to her, to ask her why she had called the police, why she hadn't trusted him. But he held his tongue. What would be the point? Would it even matter? Isaiah, calmly, hey. Susan looked down for a moment before stepping off her porch, walking slowly toward him. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and there was a nervousness in her step. Susan, tentatively, I want to say I'm sorry, Isaiah. I never meant to. I never wanted to make you feel like you did something wrong. I was just scared. I thought I saw something, but I was wrong. And I'm sorry for that. Isaiah looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Her apology felt too little, too late, but something in her voice made him pause. It was clear she wasn't just apologizing for calling the cops. She was apologizing for a much deeper fear she had carried for years. Isaiah, after a long silence, I know, but you need to understand. I don't want to be the person people are afraid of. I'm just me, just trying to get home like anyone else. Susan swallowed hard, nodding in understanding. Susan, I get it now. I do. I really do. The last moment of the day unfolded at the police station, where Officer Walker found himself sitting across from Captain Walker in the small, quiet room designated for internal discussions. The conversation had shifted from routine matters to something more personal. Captain Walker, staring at his desk, you did what you had to do, Walker. But I want you to understand something. There's more at play here than just routine. You have to see the bigger picture. Officer Walker, hesitant. I understand, sir. But what if we're getting it wrong? What if we've been doing this for so long that we can't even see the impact it has on people like Isaiah? Captain Walker, looking up, his voice quiet. It's never been just about the job, Walker. It's about trust. The public trusts us to make decisions, but sometimes those decisions have consequences. And those consequences, well, they last longer than we think. The next day, Isaiah found himself walking into school with a heavy heart. The usual buzz of students didn't quite feel the same anymore. People spoke in hushed tones as he passed, some of them glancing at him with uncertainty, others with a quiet curiosity. Isaiah had been avoiding eye contact with anyone for most of the morning, but as he sat down in his first class, a familiar voice broke through his thoughts. Jasmine, a childhood friend, sat down beside him. She had known Isaiah for years, but today, her expression was filled with concern. Jasmine, softly, Isaiah, I heard about what happened yesterday. Are you okay? Isaiah didn't answer immediately, his eyes focused on the desk in front of him. He wasn't sure what to say. Did she mean to sympathize? Or was she just curious like everyone else? Isaiah, after a long pause, I don't know, Jasmine. It just feels like everyone's talking about it. It's like they've already decided who I am. Jasmine's face softened, and she leaned in closer. She could sense the frustration and hurt in Isaiah's voice, the tension building inside him that he didn't know how to release. Jasmine, I don't know exactly what it's like, but you don't have to let anyone define you. They don't know you like I do. Isaiah looked at her, and for the first time in hours, he felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but the comfort of having someone who understood him, someone who didn't judge, made the day a little easier to face. At the police station, Captain Walker sat at his desk, staring at a series of reports laid out in front of him. The weight of yesterday's events lingered in the air, and despite his calm exterior, there was a sense of turmoil inside him. His mind was occupied by the conversation with Isaiah earlier, but more importantly, it was the conversation he had had with Officer Walker that he kept replaying. He wasn't sure if his younger officer fully understood the depth of the situation. How could he? Officer Walker had not grown up in a world where people constantly questioned his presence just because of his skin color. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Officer Davis, who had been uncharacteristically quiet over the past few days. Captain Walker, nodding, Davis, come in. Officer Davis, sir, I've been thinking about what happened with Isaiah. I know I've been a little off these past couple of days, but I wanted to talk about it. Captain Walker, leaning back in his chair, go ahead. Officer Davis, I think I understand now why things felt wrong. I did everything I was supposed to do. I followed the rules. But the rules don't always account for the way people like Isaiah are treated, and I've been a part of that. I don't want to be. Captain Walker studied Davis for a long moment. He could see the weight of realization settling on his officer's shoulders. It wasn't easy to come to terms with the systemic issues at play, but Davis was trying, and that was the first step. Captain Walker, it's not about following the rules, Davis. It's about understanding the impact of those rules, the way they affect people, and it's about having the courage to question them when they don't serve justice. Davis nodded slowly, taking in the captain's words. He wasn't sure how to move forward, but at least he knew he couldn't just ignore the problem anymore. Later that afternoon, Susan found herself standing outside her front door, staring at the same porch she had stood on the day before. The weight of her own guilt had only grown stronger with time, gnawing at her every thought. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, replaying the phone call to the police in her head. How had she let fear cloud her judgment? How had she called the police on a young boy, simply because of the way he looked? Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her purse and stepped out onto the sidewalk. She had made a decision. She was going to apologize to Isaiah in person, even if it was awkward, even if it didn't change anything. As she walked toward his house, her mind raced with the possibilities of how he might react. Would he be angry? Would he understand that she hadn't meant any harm? Or would he simply push her away? When she arrived at Isaiah's house, she was relieved to find him sitting on the front steps, staring out at the street. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing slightly as he recognized her. Susan, softly, Isaiah, I need to talk to you. Isaiah stood up, crossing his arms, a guarded expression on his face. Isaiah, what is it? Susan, I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I never meant for you to feel like a criminal. I made a mistake. I judged you, and I shouldn't have. Isaiah looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice steady but full of the emotion he had kept buried for so long. Isaiah, you didn't just make a mistake. You made me feel like I was the problem, like I was the one who had to prove something. And it's not just you. It's everyone who's ever looked at me that way. Susan felt a pang of guilt in her chest. She had never truly understood how deep the feeling of being judged ran for Isaiah, until now. Susan, softly, I see that now, and I'm sorry for making you feel that way. I promise I'll do better. Isaiah didn't respond right away. Instead, he simply turned and started walking back into his house. But before he entered, he paused and looked back at her. Isaiah, just be better. For everyone. With that, he disappeared inside, leaving Susan standing alone on the porch. A part of her wanted him to say more, to tell her it was okay, to somehow make her feel better. But instead, She was left with a lesson, one she wasn't sure she was ready to learn, but one she would never forget. The following evening, Isaiah sat alone in his room, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. The conversation with Susan still echoed in his mind, but now a different voice reached out to him. Jasmine, knocking on his door before entering. Hey, you okay? Isaiah looked up, meeting her eyes with a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. He wasn't sure what to say to her. He had tried so hard to put everything out of his mind, to just focus on the day-to-day, but it wasn't working. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was changing, and yet nothing really was. Isaiah, sighing, I don't know anymore. I'm trying to be okay, but it's hard. Jasmine sat beside him on the bed, her expression softening as she looked at him. Jasmine, you don't have to figure everything out right now. You just have to know that people care about you. I care about you. Isaiah didn't say anything for a moment, but something about Jasmine's presence, her genuine concern, made him feel seen, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Isaiah, I guess. I just don't want to be seen like that. Like I'm something I'm not. Jasmine nodded. Her voice was gentle, but firm. Jasmine, I know, but you're not alone in this. And you don't have to prove anything to anyone. Isaiah managed a small smile, the first one he'd felt in days. Back at the station, Captain Walker sat in his office, the night settling in around him. He had a lot to think about, but most importantly, he needed to think about his next steps. What would he do moving forward? As he reached for the phone, his hand hovered for a moment, then he dialed a number he had been avoiding for weeks. The call was brief, but it was all he needed to begin the process of change. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. In response to the incident with Isaiah, a community meeting had been called at the local church. The residents, feeling the ripple effects of the police encounter, were gathering to discuss their concerns about safety, racial profiling, and the relationship between the police and the community. Isaiah's mother, Tanya, was one of the first to arrive, standing near the door, scanning the room. It was a space filled with people she had known for years, but today the air felt charged with uncertainty. This meeting wasn't just about Isaiah. It was about how the entire community was being treated by the police, how they were seen, and how they were going to move forward. Tanya, whispering to a neighbor, I'm just hoping we can get some answers tonight. As the meeting began, Isaiah and his father, Captain Walker, entered together. There was an obvious tension between them, but Isaiah could see his father's resolve. Captain Walker wasn't just there as a parent. He was there as an officer of the law, trying to navigate the delicate balance between his duty and his family. The room quieted as the pastor, Pastor Williams, took the podium to begin the discussion. Pastor Williams, calmly, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're here tonight to talk about our community, our children, and our safety. Specifically, we want to address the incident that took place earlier this week involving one of our young men, Isaiah Walker. Isaiah felt the weight of the room's gaze shift to him. His heart raced, but he stood firm. He wasn't just the son of a police captain anymore. He was his own person, and he was done hiding. As the pastor opened the floor for comments, the room was filled with murmurs. People were eager to speak, but the conversation was tense. Finally, Isaiah stood up. His voice was steady, but the emotion was clear. Isaiah, I just want to say, what happened to me on the street wasn't an isolated incident. It's not about me or my dad. It's about how people who look like me are treated every day. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just walking home, but it felt like I was guilty before I even opened my mouth. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. The room fell silent as Isaiah's words hung in the air. There were no immediate responses, but the weight of his speech settled over everyone. It was clear that this wasn't just a single incident. It was part of a larger pattern. Isaiah, I don't want to be treated like I'm a problem. I'm just a kid trying to get home, just like anyone else. But every time I leave my house, I feel like I'm carrying something extra, and it shouldn't be that way. After a moment, Jasmine, who had been sitting quietly, stood up from the back. Her voice was strong, and she spoke with a sense of urgency. Jasmine, Isaiah's right. This is bigger than just him. It's about how we, as a community, are treated. We have to stop letting fear control how we see each other. Fear of the police, fear of young black men, fear of everything. That fear is dividing us, and we need to change that. Isaiah felt a surge of gratitude toward her. Her words, along with his own, felt like a weight being lifted, even if only for a moment. Captain Walker, who had been sitting silently beside Isaiah, stood up. His expression was solemn, but there was an honesty in his voice as he addressed the room. Captain Walker, I hear you, and I know that I've been a part of the problem. I'm an officer of the law, and I'm supposed to protect and serve. But I also know that sometimes the people I'm supposed to protect feel like they're under attack. I can't change what happened yesterday, but I can listen, and I can help change the way things are done. There was a murmur in the crowd. Some people nodded, but others remained skeptical. They had heard similar promises before, from different officers, from different officials. But this time, it felt different. Captain Walker's admission of his role in the system felt like a first step towards something more meaningful. Captain Walker, it's not just about punishing bad officers. It's about fixing the system. It's about making sure every single person, regardless of the color of their skin, feels safe when they walk down the street. And that starts with me. I'm willing to take the steps necessary to make sure we do better, not just for my son, but for all our children. There was a brief pause, then a slow round of applause. It wasn't an applause for perfection, but for the courage to begin facing the problem head-on. As the meeting continued, the conversation grew more heated. While some of the community expressed hope at Captain Walker's words, others were more skeptical, having experienced years of mistrust and disappointment. Mrs. Jenkins, an older woman from the neighborhood, stood up. Mrs. Jenkins, sharply, you can't just say things will change. We've been hearing that for years. What are you actually going to do about it? We don't need promises. We need action. Her words hit the room hard, and a few others began to murmur in agreement. They weren't content with speeches. They wanted results. They wanted justice, not just words. Pastor Williams, trying to regain control. We need to make sure that, moving forward, there is accountability. There needs to be a process where we, as a community, can have our voices heard, not just in meetings, but in real action. Isaiah looked over at his father, who seemed deep in thought. Captain Walker had always believed in law and order, but this was different. His son's words, Jasmine's words, the words of the community, they weren't just demands for action. They were calls for change that could no longer be ignored. Later that evening, after the meeting had concluded, Susan showed up at the church. She stood at the entrance, hesitant at first, but then she saw Isaiah standing near the door. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Susan took a deep breath and walked up to him. She had come to offer one last apology, not just for calling the cops on him, but for not seeing him as a person, a neighbor, and a human being first. Susan, Isaiah, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. For calling the police, for not seeing you for who you are, for letting fear control me. Isaiah looked at her, his expression softening slightly. It wasn't that he had forgiven her. It was that he could see the sincerity in her eyes. Isaiah, quietly, thank you. But it's not just you. It's a lot of people who need to change. Susan nodded. She didn't expect forgiveness. She just needed Isaiah to know that she was trying. As the meeting wound down, Captain Walker and Isaiah walked home together in silence. The night air was cool, and the weight of the conversation still hung heavy between them. But Isaiah could feel something shift within his father. He wasn't just an officer anymore. He was a father, a community member, and a catalyst for change. Isaiah, finally breaking the silence. So, what now? Captain Walker, glancing at him. Now we keep pushing, we keep talking, we keep listening. We make sure the changes we talked about don't just stay words. It's a long road, but it's a road we have to walk together. Isaiah nodded. It was going to be a difficult journey, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. Isaiah, I think we can start making a difference. As they walked down the quiet street, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the cool night, a small, but significant step toward a future that felt just a little bit more hopeful. The morning after the community meeting, Captain Walker sat alone in his office at the precinct. The conversation from last night echoed in his mind. The skepticism, the raw honesty, and the overwhelming desire for change. He could feel the pressure mounting, not just from his community but from within himself. The phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. It was Officer Walker, his son's colleague. Officer Walker, grimly, "Captain, we need to talk?" "Captain Walker, what's going on?" "Officer Walker, it's about the meeting last night. Word's getting around. Some of the officers aren't happy with the way you spoke. They're questioning your loyalty to the force." Captain Walker's jaw tightened. He had anticipated some resistance, but hearing it directly from one of his own officers stung. "Captain Walker," after a pause, "I'm not here to be liked. I'm here to do what's right." Officer Walker, "Sir, I understand, but this could cause some real tension. If you're going to make changes, you need to be prepared for pushback." Captain Walker leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. He had made a commitment to change, but it was clear that commitment came with a cost. How far was he willing to go? And was he prepared to lose the support of his own team? Meanwhile, at school, Isaiah was struggling with the aftermath of the community meeting. While his friends and peers were more supportive than ever, he could feel the unease in the air. It wasn't just about the incident anymore. It was about what his words had sparked. Some students, mostly those who hadn't walked in his shoes, didn't quite understand what he was trying to say. Others, like Jasmine, continued to stand by him. Jasmine, sitting next to him in class, "You did good last night, Isaiah. People are talking. They're thinking." Isaiah nodded, though his mind wasn't in the classroom. He was still processing everything. The community's reaction was mixed, and there were some who saw him as a troublemaker, someone causing drama. He hated that, but he knew there was nothing to do but push forward. "Isaiah, yeah, but I don't know if it'll actually change anything. They say they want change, but change takes time, right? And sometimes I'm not even sure it's possible." "Jasmine, change isn't easy, but I believe in you, and I think people are starting to listen." Isaiah smiled at his friend's words, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Deep down, he knew it wasn't just about changing people's minds. It was about changing an entire system. Later that evening, the Walker family gathered for dinner. The tension in the room was palpable. Isaiah, usually the one who kept the conversation light, now felt more distant. Tanya, his mother, sensed it. She'd seen her husband shift, too, and she could feel the weight of the decision he had made to speak out. "Tanya," quietly, "how did it go at the station today?" Captain Walker, frowning, "It was difficult. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but things are more complicated than I thought. Some of the officers aren't on board with what I said last night." Isaiah looked up from his plate. He had heard bits of the conversation from earlier, but hadn't realized how serious it was. "Isaiah, you knew this was coming, right? People don't like change." Captain Walker, "I know, but I also know that silence is part of the problem. I have a responsibility to make things right, and that means facing uncomfortable truths." Tanya remained quiet for a moment. She was proud of her husband, but she also knew the cost of speaking out. It wasn't just a matter of personal integrity. It was about family, career, and reputation. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. The next morning, news of the community meeting continued to circulate. Susan, who had apologized to Isaiah the night before, had taken it upon herself to start speaking to other neighbors, urging them to engage in dialogue and to hold the police accountable. At the local coffee shop, a small group of residents gathered, discussing the events of the past week. Mrs. Jenkins, who had been vocal in her skepticism during the meeting, was sitting with a few others, her arms crossed as she listened to Susan. Mrs. Jenkins, skeptically, "I don't know. Captain Walker might be saying the right things now, but that's not enough. We've heard it all before. What matters is what happens next." Susan, calmly, "I understand your frustration, but we have to give them a chance to act. We can't change anything if we don't try. We need to hold them accountable, but we also need to engage." Mrs. Jenkins, sighing, "Engage? With the police?" It's not just about talking, Susan. We've been talking for years. We need to see real action. Susan sat down across from her eyes intense. Susan, I know, but if we don't push for change, if we don't at least try to have an open dialogue, we're never going to get anywhere. At the precinct, Officer Walker found himself in a dilemma. He had always respected Captain Walker, but the changes his superior had suggested felt like a betrayal of everything he had been taught. The idea of overhauling the police department and addressing its flaws seemed foreign, almost impossible. He sat in the break room, discussing it with another officer, Officer Hernandez. Officer Hernandez, frustrated, I just don't get it. Why is he doing this? He's risking everything. His career, his position. I thought he was one of us. Officer Walker, he is one of us. But I don't know anymore. He's pushing for something that I'm not sure we're ready for. I'm not sure I'm ready for. Officer Hernandez, laughing bitterly, ready for what? To question everything we've been taught? To challenge the system? Officer Walker, I'm just saying, I think he's serious about this. And if he's serious, I don't know where I stand. The uncertainty weighed heavily on him. On one hand, he understood the captain's desire for change. On the other, he feared what those changes might mean for him and his colleagues. Later that evening, Captain Walker sat with Isaiah in the living room. It had been a long day, and both of them were exhausted. Isaiah noticed the weariness in his father's eyes, but there was also a flicker of hope, something he hadn't seen before. Isaiah, quietly, Dad, do you think things will actually change? Captain Walker looked at his son, his face softening. He wasn't sure if the changes he hoped for would come quickly, or if they would come at all. But he knew that this was the moment to start. Captain Walker, I don't know, Isaiah, but I do know that we have to try. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take time, and it's going to take everyone working together. But I promise you, I'm not backing down. Isaiah didn't say anything for a moment, but he could see the sincerity in his father's eyes. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start, and sometimes a start was all you needed to make a difference. The morning after the meeting, Captain Walker arrived at the precinct to find a different atmosphere. It was clear that his speech at the community meeting had shaken things up, but now there were new faces in the office, faces that had been part of the discussions he started the night before. As he entered his office, Officer Walker was there, waiting. Officer Walker, hesitant, Sir, I need to talk to you. Captain Walker raised an eyebrow. The tone in his son's voice was different, more serious than usual. Captain Walker, what's on your mind? Officer Walker, pausing, I've been thinking about what you said last night about accountability, and I've had some conversations with a few of the guys. They're nervous, but they're listening. We don't know exactly how to go about it, but we want to be part of this. We want to change things, too. Captain Walker felt a rush of hope, tempered with the knowledge that real change would be a slow process. But the fact that his officers were willing to open up, to reconsider their role, was a start. Captain Walker, nodding slowly, we'll start with small steps, but it has to come from all of us, from the top down and the bottom up. It's not going to be easy. Officer Walker, I know, but if we don't try, nothing will change. And I think we owe it to the people we serve and to our families to make it better. Captain Walker sighed, a heavy but hopeful sigh. Captain Walker, all right, let's get to work. Later that afternoon, Isaiah and Jasmine were walking home from school together. The day had been quiet, but there was an underlying tension in the air. While things were changing, the road ahead still seemed uncertain. Jasmine, grinning, I think people are starting to listen. There's this talk in class now about what's going on with the police and how we can actually make a difference. It's like we're finally being heard. Isaiah, quietly, yeah, but I don't know. It's hard to believe it'll really change anything. People get complacent. They forget that we need real action, not just talk. Jasmine, I get that. But isn't this what we've wanted all along? To be heard? To make sure that things don't just stay the same? Isaiah looked at her, his face softening. She was right. For the first time, people were talking. Maybe that was the first step. Isaiah, sighing, I guess. It's just, Hard to imagine it'll actually be different. But maybe we've got to start somewhere, right? Jasmine, nodding, yeah. And you started it, Isaiah. You spoke up, and now people are talking about it. That's a win. Isaiah smiled, a small but genuine smile, as they continued walking. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time, Isaiah felt like change wasn't just a distant dream. A week later, Captain Walker stood before a gathering of community members, police officers, and local leaders. It was a public address, a follow-up to the meeting that had sparked so much discussion. Captain Walker, speaking into the microphone, thank you all for coming. I stand before you today not just as a police officer, but as a father, a member of this community, and a person who believes in the potential for change. I know that trust has been broken, and I know that words alone won't repair that damage. But I also know that silence is no longer an option. He paused, looking over the crowd. Isaiah, sitting with his mother, watched intently. Captain Walker, we have begun the process of re-examining our policies and training programs within this department. We will be introducing mandatory community engagement programs for all officers. We will listen to the concerns of our neighbors, and we will be held accountable for our actions. This is just the beginning, but it's a beginning nonetheless. The crowd was quiet, but there was an unmistakable shift in the room. People were paying attention, listening, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like something real was happening. At the back of the crowd, Susan and Mrs. Jenkins stood together. Both women had been through their own struggles. Susan had been wrestling with guilt and doubt, and Mrs. Jenkins had long been an outspoken critic of the police. But today, both of them were listening, and something had changed in them too. Susan, quietly, do you think it'll actually work? Mrs. Jenkins, thoughtfully, I don't know, but he's trying. And that's more than I've seen before. Maybe that's all we can ask for right now. A start? Susan nodded, taking in the words. The skepticism was still there, but so was a faint sense of hope. Susan, it's a start, yes, but let's make sure we hold them to it. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Mrs. Jenkins, smiling slightly, oh, I'm with you on that one. The two women exchanged a knowing glance, their mutual wariness tempered by a cautious optimism. Later that evening, Captain Walker and his family sat down to dinner again. The atmosphere was lighter than it had been in weeks, but still, there was a sense of gravity in the air. They all knew that the work had only just begun. Tanya, I'm proud of you, you know. Captain Walker, softly, it's not just me. It's everyone. We've got a long road ahead, but I'm ready for it. Isaiah looked at his father, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. But this time, there was understanding and a shared commitment to do better. Isaiah, I just want things to be different, Dad. For everyone. For me. For people who look like me. Captain Walker nodded, his eyes sincere. Captain Walker. And we're going to make sure it happens, Isaiah. We're going to make sure it happens. The next day, Captain Walker was at the precinct again. His office door was open, and there was a new sense of purpose in the air. Officers were meeting in small groups, talking about the changes that were being implemented. There was a growing awareness among them that the world outside the precinct was changing, and they needed to change with it. Officer Walker, entering the office, Sir, we've got the first community forum scheduled for next week. We're going to start rolling out the training programs, too. Captain Walker, nodding, good. Let's make sure it's not just for show. Let's make it count. As he stood there, looking out over the precinct, Captain Walker knew that the work was far from over. But it was no longer just about policy changes or public speeches. It was about creating a real, lasting shift. One where the community felt safe, heard, and respected. And that shift had already begun.